Hey everyone, greetings. Hope everyone is doing well. Once again, my apologies on getting this out a little bit later than expected. I had this stuff all ready to go about Tuesday. I tried to upload it Wednesday, do some technological upgrades, some flash drives, computers, and the whole thing just completely broke. So I had to restart these from scratch, but it's okay. It's okay. Hopefully, you enjoy these online modules as they increase your knowledge on various wars. If you remember in the first module, we took a look at what are the causes of 20th century wars, what are the effects, and we use these general terms to describe them. We also spent some time to talk about how wars in the 20th century changed, as well as the different types of war. If you remember, one of the most extreme types of war is total war. We've only had two total wars, World War One and World War Two. We covered those in junior year. If you remember, an entire unit on the cause of World War One, an entire unit on the fighting of World War One. Same thing with World War Two. These wars are a little bit different, and so what I have is a video presentation for each one of them. So we'll start today with our first case study. This is a limited war, so again, we're not using all our resources, usually between two powers or something like that, and the region we'll be looking at is the Americas. So anyways, we'll start and get ourselves going here and learning about this war. I just want to start with a brief overview to kind of get you thinking about what's kind of going on here in this Falklands War. So first off, you probably have never heard of the Falklands War. Maybe you never even heard of the Falkland Islands. Here they are, these small little islands, about 300 miles off the coast of Argentina in the South Atlantic Ocean. This war is going to be taking place in 1982, only a couple months, so it's relatively brief and relatively quick. There is technically no official declaration of war when the sides go to war. However, we would still consider this a war. If you remember, even the Vietnam War, there was technically no official American declaration of war, but we would by all means consider that a war. This is much less of a conflict, but nonetheless, we do have fighting, we do have casualties, we do have armed conflict to try to solve a dispute, so we would still consider this a war. This war is incredibly unexpected, and you'll see that the causes, although they're there, are not, dating back to these really intense conflicts. If you think about World War One or something like that, instead, some kind of long-seated issues culminating, and then some, miscommunication and things like that will lead to this kind of strange conflict. Another reason why it's insignificant is you have to realize that this island that they're going to be fighting over, the Falkland Islands, is relatively insignificant. We'll talk more about the Falklands in a little bit, but at the time of the war, only about 2,000 people living in the Falklands, over 30,000 troops fighting in the Falklands. So the question kind of becomes, why is fighting even happen? And who are the major countries fighting? Well, this map is designed to kind of show this. We're going to have on one side Britain and the United Kingdom, and then on the other side we're going to have Argentina. So anyways, we'll go through and kind of see what happens here, what causes this war, how does the fighting kind of take place, and then what are the effects of this war. Now, the next thing I want to do here is give you a little bit of background into the causes of the war. So you can kind of see from the map, the Falklands are islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 300 miles away from Argentina, so relatively close. Britain, over 8,000 miles away, so significant distance. Now, we do want to realize that before this war, and really since the existence and the start of Argentina and Britain have relatively good relations, and those relations primarily are economic, with Britain being a large buyer of some major Argentinian exports. And again, that's somewhat expected. We do see Britain, the United States, other countries that became big buyers of Latin American goods. So certainly in the 1800s, 1900s, it was definitely Britain buying a lot of Argentinian produce primarily. Now, we also want to kind of see this together. Again, this war is happening in the 1980s, so this is in the middle of the Cold War. By many means, in kind of the heart of the Cold War, as Reagan had escalated the conflict in the early 80s. Well, Britain, as we remember, although their power has decreased after World War II, they are still a major Cold War power. Member of NATO, member of the UN Security Council, big kind of deal. On the other hand, we have Argentina, which would follow many of the countries that we remember from our study of the Cold War in Latin America. Relatively insignificant. Argentina really hadn't been to a serious war since the 1800s, kind of an afterthought in the overall Cold War type thing. Although, the United States wanted to make sure these Latin American countries didn't become communist at the end of the day, they kind of took them for granted, not that big of a deal in the whole thing. And so that's kind of interesting. Another thing why this war is kind of surprising is that this is not like the Falklands, although they're these small islands or some economic powerhouse. Instead, in the 1980s, their major export and their major economic industry is based upon sheep farming. So again, it's not an incredibly profitable industry, so it's not like there's some big economic gain to having control of the islands. And so that's something that we'll kind of look at. Why does this war happen? Finally, last thing I want to say here is that the Falklands are a part of Britain, and by the 1980s, they are part of a declining British Empire. And although Britain still has control of the Falklands in the 1980s, their control over most areas has steeply and majorly declined into the 1980s. And again, you can see that really after World War II. Again, if we look at this graph and we look at this kind of together, we can see that after World War II, the British Empire has severely fallen in strength and numbers, etc. However, still holding on to the Falklands. So that idea of a declining British Empire will certainly play a part in this as well. Now, when we talk about the Falklands War, there's really only kind of one major long-term cause, and that is the legacy of colonialism. So let me kind of bring this into perspective for you. Argentina, like many other Latin American countries, will get their independence in the early 1800s, specifically for Argentina, 1816 from Spain. And if you kind of remember, when these Latin American countries become independent, their transition to independence is not going to be very easy. And so they will rely heavily on European countries primarily to economically invest. And Argentina is going to be no exception to that, with the British economically investing heavily in Argentina. That being said, relations were pretty good because Argentina was largely supported because of this economic investment. However, for a long period of time, there was tension over these islands, as you see here in the map, known as the Falkland Islands. And so the question kind of became who had control of them. And originally, when they were independent, basically right after they became independent, Argentina said, hey, we're in control here, they're closest to us, etc. And Britain is going to say no. And Britain is going to control them, and then there'll be British people that will actually move to the Falklands. And officially by the 1880s, 1890s, the Falklands will be established as a formal British colony. But either way, even from the early 1800s, it was clear it was the British that were, kind of had their strong presence, strong control over in the Falklands. Now, Argentina, not thrilled about this, but kind of accepted it. The difference, though, is going to come after World War II. And if you remember, and we'll kind of get into this, when World War II ends, so does largely the British Empire. And many of these former colonies that were so critical and so important to them are going to start to, become independent. And Britain will largely let them become independent as they want to focus on their own dealings. However, the Falklands is going to be an area that will not become independent and still be under British control. Well, what's going to happen here is because of all the places that are becoming independent and because of the major decolonization, the United Nations establishes a committee on decolonization, and they hear various cases. Well, this one they hear in the 60s, and they kind of are going back and forth what exactly to do. And so what you have is obviously Britain and Argentina, the main ones negotiating about what to do with these Falkland Islands. On the one hand, you have Britain who says, yeah, we are decolonizing, but the reality is we've done a good job here. Things are good. The economy, seems fine. We are protecting this place who basically would be unprotected without our support, etc. And Argentina is going to say, oh, how dare you? This was part of us during the colonial period, and we should, be the ones in charge. And so these negotiations will be going on into the 60s, into the 70s, and then into the early 80s. Now, there's a couple of things that you want to realize. Again, these are kind of these random islands in the South Atlantic Ocean, which means that for the British, who have many other possessions, as well as are trying to kind of secure their place in Europe, this is not going to hold that much value. However, for Argentina, these islands do hold a lot of value, and so trying to attain them is kind of a matter of big importance for them, and they really think that would be really great towards increasing their power. The other fact that you have to realize is that the actual Falkland citizens themselves, although not very many, again, only a couple thousand, overwhelmingly wanted to remain British. They definitely did not want to be a part of Argentina, especially with some of the things going on in Argentina, and we'll talk about that going forward. But during the Cold War, Argentina was not a good place. A lot of corruption, a lot of kind of bad stuff going on there, and so the Falklanders they were very happy to be British. They wanted to remain British and things like that. So we have to take that into value as well. All right, and this is much more of a short-term cause, has to do with some issues going on in both Argentina and Britain. And so something like the Falklands War will hope to serve as somewhat of a distraction from these issues. So by the 1980s, there is a military regime in charge of Argentina. And their leader is this gentleman you see here, Leopoldo Galtieri. Now, Galtieri is a military dictator, so basically what is the first thing he's going to do? Completely cut the public sector of Argentina and move to the private sector. Well, that's not going to be good, as there's going to be a lot of economic issues that come into play. And so again, even though he's a military dictator and he's trying to, keep control through troops and all the rest of that stuff, the reality is, you still need to do some forms of economic progress in order to be successful. There's also more political issues at play for Argentina. So, for example, Galtieri and his military regime were involved in something known as the Dirty War, which was basically going after supposed communists, other leftists, anyone that was perceived to be opposed to him and his military regime, which meant that many had died, many disappeared, similar trends that we remember from the Cold War period. In addition to this, there's also political pressures to stabilize and, again, try to bring about some type of political stability, bring around support to his dictatorship. So, again, something like a war can serve as a foreign policy distraction, so you have those things kind of coming into play. Now, the other country involved here, Britain, is also going to be experiencing kind of similar issues. They're not obviously going to be under a military dictatorship, but a lot of economic issues. Huge unemployment, a lot of riots going on in some of the major cities over working conditions, unemployment, etc. Really, really bad stuff. So again, you're looking for the foreign policy distraction. Another thing is that by the 1980s, early 1980s, we have a new prime minister in Britain. Her name is Margaret Thatcher. You might have heard of her before. She's kind of famous. Well, by the 1980s, she really was having trouble, and she had her Conservative Party in the parliament, no real control over them. It looked like, she might get voted out and all the rest of these things. Thatcher's nickname was the Iron Lady, and she had gotten this nickname for being strong-willed and being really adamant about, her positions and all the rest of those things, and kind of taking a strong line. Well, about 2-3 years into her role as prime minister, she had not at all fulfilled these expectations, and she was kind of seen as someone who was kind of being pushed around and things like that. So, really, also, again, this overarching idea of looking for the political distraction. Now, before Thatcher had taken place, again, we want to remember that Britain overall is kind of decreasing their empire and things like that. And so the British had considered kind of giving away the Falklands to Argentina and kind of focusing on other things, etc. However, again, going back to the similar point, the Falklanders themselves did not want to be a part of Argentina. This, by the way, is some graphics from the Dirty War, and again, we see what we expect to be people that have been killed. Again, disappeared, but most likely killed because of the corruption within this military regime and military dictatorship. This is Margaret Thatcher, and this is her when she's taking on the role of Prime Minister in 1979, only a couple years before the conflict. And again, she had gotten this reputation and this nickname of being the Iron Lady, but only a couple years into her prime ministership, she really hadn't shown that at all, unfortunately. Okay, the next thing that we're going to look at is specifically the military causes of war, and primarily this has to do with the naval forces for both sides. So anyways, we'll kind of look at this and see what's going on. Now, a lot of this war and some of the reasons why it happens is miscommunication. And if you think about it, this concept of miscommunication is something that happens frequently and oftentimes leads to conflict. Our next war, that's a limited war that we'll be looking at the first call for, some of the reasons why it has to do with miscommunication. Well, what is this miscommunication? Well, Britain thought that Argentina was kind of building up their military to try to get a stronger seat at the negotiating table. And then on the alternate side, which wasn't true, by the way, because Argentina was strengthening their military, but it was foreign invasion. And then secondly, the other thing is that we have the Argentinians who basically think, hey, don't worry, the British will not risk a war. They're not interested in that. And both of those are going to be wrong. So again, we always want to be thinking about how failure to communicate and failure to really think this stuff through oftentimes leads to a lot of problems and issues. Now, there's another reality of this, which is that the Argentinian military really kind of hoped that they could kind of show their strength and, you know, show their legitimacy by getting a big military victory by taking over the Falklands. The other thing they were trying to do is test British commitment. There were many top people in the Argentinian military that basically thought if they sent an invasion force and basically claimed the islands, the British would basically say, hey, you know what, we're not going to bother, we're not going to send over, you know, we're 8,000 miles away, we're not going to bother with this. Here, let's you know, hash out a negotiation and let's kind of figure that out. Well, that's, again, kind of not going to be the case, but at least these are some of the ideas that are floating around here. Now, there's also another deal that deals with both here, the British and the Argentinians as far as perception, but this has to do with foreign policy. And again, as we've said before, by the 1980s, the British Empire is almost non-existent. I mean, they have really decolonized all these places that used to be part of their empire have become independent. But the Falklands is an exception to that. So again, for the British, the question becomes, well, should we just kind of let this place go? I mean, who really cares? And then for the Argentinians, this becomes kind of a, well, I don't think the British will bother, you know, with it. And so, again, that's not going to be the case at all. Now, when we get to Argentina, there's something going on, which is, remember, the military regime in power is army. And Galtieri is an army guy. It rests on authority of the army. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only armed forces in Argentina. There are other armed forces. However, the army is the major one in control. Well, the Navy had basically only given support to Galtieri if he supported naval plans to remove the British from the Falklands. And so, again, this is kind of sticks Galtieri in a tough place. He's just taken over. His regime does not have much legitimacy at this point, and so basically he has to kind of support these plans. The reason the Navy gets involved for Britain has to do with this gentleman that you see here, which is Admiral Henry Leach. And what's going to happen is after the Argentina military invades the Falklands, many in Thatcher's cabinet are going to be saying, hey, you know what? It's not worth it. This is our reputation. This is your reputation. You really can't lose this. Why don't you not worry about it? And actually, what's going to end up happening is that he's going to be basically the one guy, and again, he's a big Navy guy that says, we can beat him. We can do it. And again, Thatcher will be largely relying on that opinion when she decides to go tough towards war and all the rest of those things altogether. Now, as we get closer towards the invasion, we are going to kind of see this unravel. So first off, Argentina, their Navy has two kind of major plans to take back the Falklands from Britain. One is to set up a presence on the island of South Georgia, get some people over there, start to kind of establish a kind of a setup. And the second is a full-scale invasion. And so, again, that's kind of the steps in which they're looking to do this. Now, Britain kind of going towards this idea of, decolonizing and, de-empiring is going to remove one of their major ships, the HMS Endurance, which was the ship that was basically tasked with patrolling the South Atlantic. Well, when they do this, they kind of send an unintentional sign to Argentina, which is kind of like, hey, we're gone. And so Argentina is going to see this as being a good time. And so at this point, this is when they started to send workers to South Georgia. And again, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to basically prepare for a full-scale military invasion to take place. Well, obviously, Britain, it's not like their presence is completely gone just because they removed the HMS Endurance. They see this going on, and they say, okay, this is not good. And so this is when they're going to bring back the HMS Endurance after just a short period of time to basically try to deal with the Argentinian workers that have now kind of started to settle. And again, no one's stupid here. They're there to ready for a full-scale Argentine invasion. The other kind of thing that's making this complicated is you do have the media, and the media is making reports that this was part of some bigger war. And again, both the sides kind of have something at stake with these kind of reports. And so that's what's making things a little more complicated. Argentina, they are going to take advantage of these media reports. They're going to say, hey, we got to go now. That's what's going to happen. And so this Argentinian invasion force is going to establish themselves and officially move onto the island and set themselves up to take it over. And so now what we have here are several hundred troops, tanks, destroyers, aircraft carriers, the whole deal. And so again, their goal here is to actually establish themselves on the island and now the islands, and then take it over by force. And so this is taking place in April of 1982. And so now once this has gone, this is the official marking point where we see that we are headed towards a war altogether. Now let's kind of take a look at the moves after this invasion in April of 1982. First off, even after the invasion, war was not necessarily inevitable. There were many hopes for a diplomatic response to take place. The groups coming together, hey, look, let's try to come up with some type of diplomatic agreement on how to deal with the Falklands. However, the reality is for Thatcher, she thought the public would be very outraged. The press would be outraged if she was negotiating with another country. And also negotiating, remember, the Falklands is a part of Britain, so if she negotiates and gives up any power to Falklands to Argentina, she's lost. And so again, her reputation is already kind of not that strong in the early 80s, and so now it becomes, okay, look, let's kind of get together here. Let's kind of deal with this. And so she says, let's go. And again, this goes back to Henry Leach. And again, many in Thatcher's cabinet and others are saying, hey, look, not worth it. Don't even worry about it, etc. And he's going to be saying, hey, look, we can do this. And she will much more be listening to him because she knows that this is incredibly important. However, by dedicating forces to this war, you are putting the British reputation at stake. And what you really need to make sure is that you essentially win, because if not, this is going to be a disaster for Thatcher. This is going to lead to a decrease in kind of British morale, British reputation, etc. And so that's what's going to happen. Now, this is at the point where British forces will be sent over to the Falklands to get ready to go. They will assemble pretty quickly. Again, it's a limited force that's sent over there. It's not the whole military by any means, but nonetheless, they're ready to go. They're ready to move about 8,000 miles to get over there and push the Argentinians out and focus on reestablishing and regaining their presence in the Falklands. The other advantage for Britain is going to be the international response that they will get. What they're going to be able to do is they are very able to get an international response in their favor. And they're going to say, hey, look, we're just defending what's ours. Argentina, they're the ones that were the aggressors. And they're absolutely right, and that makes sense, etc. And so what we start to see here is that the UN, at least originally, will support Britain. We'll see trade embargoes being put into place and other responses that are favorable to the British. Now, both sides are hoping as they move into the war that they will get U.S. support. And again, this is the Cold War. This is the 80s. These are both Western powers. And so the question becomes, who will the United States give their support to? Well, the obvious answer is going to be Britain. However, I'll take a minute or two to kind of describe why. Britain, first off, is a much stronger ally to the United States during the Cold War. Again, during the Cold War time, Britain is one of the United States' closest, if not the United States' closest ally. And so it only seems kind of inevitable that the United States would support Britain in any kind of conflict, including this one. The reality is Argentina, specifically Galtieri, thinks, hey, we're going to get the United States to support. People saying, why? Well, I'm an anti-communist. I'm an anti-communist in Latin America. They're going to support me, all the rest of that kind of stuff. And so what happens here is that with that going on, the reality is that's not necessarily true. And although that's kind of important, overall, it's not really enough to put this into perspective. And so instead, the United States will give Britain their support, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the reality is that is definitely a miscalculation for Argentina, thinking that some reason they would get the United States' support over Britain, which at this point in the Cold War would just not happen. Now let's take a look at the crisis and kind of its intensification. Again, there was some hope that even when the British forces were coming over, that maybe there could be some peace. Well, the reality is that that's pretty far-fetched, because as the British forces are moving in to the Falklands in order to push the Argentinians out of the Falklands, the other thing is that the Argentinian forces are building themselves up. And so, again, at this point, it's pretty clear, hey, look, that this ain't going to really work out. The other thing is that many are kind of looking at this and kind of criticizing both the countries, as they both seem to be kind of moving towards brinkmanship and destruction of each other over basically these relatively small and seemingly insignificant islands. And so just another kind of thing that we want to be looking at here. Again, some of this has to do with the misinterpretations that are going to be taking place here. Both sides thinking, Argentina is not going to actually do anything crazy, and Britain, same thing on the other side. So again, that's another thing that we want to be looking at. However, the conflict will only intensify, especially as the British establish, as you see here in this map, this total exclusion zone around the Falklands, and basically saying, hey, look, if you try to come into this total exclusion zone, we're going to take you down. And so sure enough, they will hold true to that, and they will sink an Argentinian ship very early on in the conflict. And again, as they do, You know, again, if there was any hopes for, you know, some type of diplomatic peace, they are now gone at this point for sure. So again, you know, we've already kind of seen peace is unachievable, but once you actually have fighting and a sinking of a ship or whatever else taking place, it's not going to kind of happen. All right, let's look at the course of war and see what's going on. Again, this is a limited war, so it's not like we're going to see, you know, these crazy casualties or these crazy technologies, even though technology will play some degree. But at the end of the day, really what this is a limited course of war. And so that's going to make things a little bit kind of different. For example, the British Navy is far superior to the Argentinian Navy. Many more ships, much stronger, much more developed, etc. However, the British will decide that they do not want to dedicate their whole navy. They do not want to dedicate their whole force to fighting in this war. And instead, they are actually only going to make the decision to send some of their ships, which is going to make things a little bit more challenging because the reality is that they just want to send everything over. Argentina didn't stand a chance. Now, as far as, you know, just thinking about this war in general, we want to remember, and again, this map kind of shows it here, Argentina only about 300 miles from the Falklands. Britain, 8,000. So a much quicker route from Argentina to the Falklands, which again is much helpful as you're trying to establish supply lines, get things over there, etc. So that's the biggest kind of advantage for Argentina. And Argentina's kind of plans are to defend their position. Again, at this point, they are in the Falklands, and their goal is to kind of use the Air Force to try to destroy this British force before they're able to land troops. And the idea is that they're able to put enough pressure here, they're going to not be able to, the British are not going to be able to have enough support and have enough, you know, kind of vig to get up there and get going. The British, on the other hand, are saying, hey, look, we're going to gain control, and we're going to gain control of both the air and the sea around the Falklands, and then we're going to be able to make that amphibious landing of ground forces onto the Falklands. And that's what's going to make us successful, and that's what's going to make this work. So again, we see two kind of sets of plans. Both seem relatively relevant. However, you know, spoiler alert, the coordination for the British plans are going to be a lot more successful. Now, if you remember from a couple slides ago, I showed you a map of the Falklands. As you kind of looked at it, there are many islands of the Falklands. However, fighting on this war specifically is basically confined to two major islands, the East Falklands and the West Falklands. Now, again, remember, there are Argentinians on the islands. At this point, by the time the British come in, there are about 13,000 Argentine troops on the islands specifically, and there's others kind of hiding out up in the hills. So again, that's good. However, the whole idea here for the Argentinians is basically to try to get to this task force at sea, because for the Argentines, they realize that if they're not able to kind of defeat this task force that's coming in, they're going to be able to land, they're going to be able to get on the ground here and come in and invade the Falklands. As they do, most likely that kind of war would favor the British. And so that's another thing that they're looking to kind of do and hoping to work this stuff out. This graph I just think is kind of nice. And again, you kind of see this going through. Big kind of differences on how the two groups will be fighting here. And again, a lot of that has to do with their aims. For Argentina, again, it's establishing that sound presence there, you know, and doing the rest of this stuff. And the reality is for Britain, although they definitely want to regain these islands, especially because they're so far away and they're not looking to make some big military, you know, victory or whatever else, they don't want to do anything too irrational. All right, another component of the fighting that we want to take a look at is what happens up in the air. So anyways, let me kind of show you what's kind of going on here. The British are definitely outnumbered as far as their planes. They're outnumbered about 3-1. So again, that's relatively significant. And, you know, their tasks are a little bit more, as they really need to make sure they protect that fleet that's coming in all the way from Britain, which are basically almost going to be open targets. Now, there is one major British advantage, and that has to do with technology, and it's with these planes here, which are the Sea Harrier planes. These are far more advanced than any Argentinian plane. They can land vertically, they can operate from short runways, etc. So even though they're outnumbers, these will be far more effective in the fighting in the air. Because of this, these planes are very effective in destroying the Argentine Air Force successfully. And again, these planes, as well as this kind of superiority up in the air, will be big for Britain and their ability to fight in the war successfully. However, that being said, this is not necessarily a total and quick defeat right away. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, again, the Argentinian Air Force, they're still going to be relatively strong. And they're also going to try to really hit those targets on the sea to put this whole thing together. Now, moving to the war at sea. Argentina will be quick to want to move the war to sea as they are kind of losing the war in the air. Again, the biggest problem for the war at sea for the British has to do with how far away they are. And again, they are, 8,000 miles away. They have a base about 3,000 miles away, but still, not very close at all. However, the British will sink a big Argentinian ship, which will be kind of significant, even though the Argentinian Navy will kind of flee. The reality is we're also going to be able to basically have the Argentinian planes from the air trying to sink the ships for kind of the rest of the duration of the war. This will be successful as there are British ships sunk. Actually, the first British ship sunk will be the first ship sunk for the British since World War II. Also kind of to be, oh my gosh, first. But, at the end of the day, this is definitely a part of the strategy. And so at this point, the British want to move the attack now to land, as they know that out on the sea, because of their distance and other things, they're kind of vulnerable targets. Finally, the next part of this that we want to be taking close attention to here has to do with the war on land. And so anyways, here's what happens. The British want to go to land. They say, okay, now is the time. We're ready to go. Let's make our move in here and let's push the Argentinians out of here. So the major goal becomes recapturing Stanley, which you can see Stanley over here. Stanley is the capital of the Falklands. Again, capturing Stanley would be very critical and very important. Again, anytime really in a war you're able to capture the capital, that's really, really a good thing. So what we see here is the British do successfully land. And again, you can kind of see it on a map here. On the Falklands through an amphibious landing, sea and land. And they're able to come in here and make kind of a dominant presence. And as they do also, they're able to, be supported through the air and all the rest of those kind of stuffs. Now, there's two major groups, as you can kind of see through this image. The first group is going to go down into Goose Green down here. And they're able to surround the Argentinian troops in Goose Green relatively easily and get them to surrender. However, the bigger place they need to go to is Stanley. And so you see this other group's going to come in. They're going to come into Stanley. And then once the troops at Goose Green are done, they are also going to come into Stanley. And they're going to fight out at the Battle of Stanley. Well, the British attack the Argentinian forces at Stanley at night. They are able to surround Stanley. And once they do and surround it successfully, Argentinians will surrender, and we will see the end of the war. And at this point, although the war had only been going on for a short period of time, the reality is the discipline, the will to fight, all the rest of those things had really been lost for Argentina. And so at this point, we have a British victory. Now, let's talk briefly about the war on the home front, because the reality is in World War One and World War Two, we have really lengthy discussions about this. Well, the reality is because this is a limited war, it has a very limited impact on the home front. That is especially the case for the British. The British will not conscript soldiers, for example. However, Argentina will be forced to conscript soldiers to make sure they're able to get enough troops to fight. What we also see is that in Argentina, there is kind of a social impact. English music is not to be played on the radio or anything like that. We also see British businesses and British stores in Argentina that are, we see demonstrations against. Again, though, this isn't necessarily anything really too uncommon for a limited war. These are not like rationing or bombing civilians or bombing target centers, etc. Instead, what we see is relatively mild stuff. There will be some censorship of the media in Argentina. However, it will be relatively small. And so, again, another thing to kind of put our attention to and see this all together. Now, let's take a look at some of the roles of the outside powers. Again, this is very much a war between the UN and the US. However, there is some stuff going on here that we do want to be kind of focused on and paying attention to. For the UN, the ultimate goal for them is to limit war. And if you remember at the beginning parts of the conflict, the UN is trying to kind of negotiate peace between the two sides. That will be unsuccessful. However, they do attempt to at least bring peace to the table. Once peace is not necessarily avoided and once it's clear that there is going to be conflict, the big role for the UN does become in trying to prevent any type of escalation of the conflict. And again, you can say there's other reasons for not escalating the conflict that Britain and Argentina were more so involved with. But either way, we don't want to discredit this overall. Now, again, for the U.S., no support to Argentina will be relatively significant. And again, that will help this kind of bring things together. The support that the U.S. does provide for the British will be relatively important. What type of support? Primarily logistical support and trying to get those British soldiers, British Navy, British forces over across the sea. They'll allow Britain to use some of their bases and other things like that along the way, as well as supply them with some fuel. Another thing that you want to be looking at here, and definitely helpful for the war, is that Britain is able to gain diplomatic victory before the war begins, as well as throughout the wartime. And again, a lot of that has to do with the United States, but also the UN and other places that do see Argentina as being the aggressor and do basically see Britain as just trying to get back what they lost. Now, definitely something we want to talk about a little bit explicitly here. What are the reasons for British victory? Why do they win? Well, a few reasons. First off, the British are much better trained and much better prepared for the conditions of the Falklands, which is going to help them be more successful. Again, as I kind of stated previously, the United States will prove to be a useful ally. They'll also be able to get some of their other allies to, blockade sales of weapons and other products to Argentina, and other things like that, which will be helpful for the war effort. Again, remember, Britain is part of the UN Security Council. That means they hold one of the highest positions in the United Nations. And as they do, they're able to use that to get support overall. Now, the British also have much less casualties. And again, some of that has to do with their goals of war. But basically, for every 14 Argentinian soldiers that die, only one British soldier does. So again, much more effective at basically not having to fight this ultimate war of death, destruction, etc. On the alternate side, we can also look at kind of weaknesses of the Argentinian military. First off, Argentinian military training relatively low, not very strong, etc. Not a lot of confidence for our Argentinian soldiers. We also see a loss of sympathy. Again, when this whole thing started, there were some that kind of had sympathy for Argentina, did see, that the Falklands were close to them. They kind of saw the Falklands as being a part of them for a long period of time. Well, when they start attacking and start trying to take over the Falklands by force, many are going to say, "Hey, look, that wasn't kind of the plan. That wasn't the idea," and they're going to really lose sympathy. We also see a division of soldiers. This happens a lot. If you think about Vietnam, this is also something that happened when you conscript soldiers. There's usually a divide between your better trained soldiers, your professional soldiers, and the soldiers that you get through conscription or you get through the draft. And so, with that being the case, that division will be problematic as the war goes on. And so, that's something that we want to be kind of looking at. And again, it's relatively common. We also see kind of bad planning and bad strategies. Again, did not really win the war in the air. Again, did not really win the war in the sea either. Bad coordination between land, air, sea, etc. Again, in these more modern wars, you really need that coordination in order to be successful. We also see weak leadership, Galtieri, but also some of our major military commanders, military forces, etc., that we want to be kind of drawing some attention to. All right, we'll now take some time to look at the results of the war. We'll start with just some general results, and then we'll move on into specific results for the countries involved and some other stuff going on. First off, again, this is a very short war, only about 2.5 months that this war is going to go on, and a minimal amount of casualties, about 1,000 deaths total, 700 plus coming from Argentina, the other 250 coming from Britain, going back to that big difference in casualties between the two sides. Now, there's no technical peace treaty signed, which isn't necessarily uncommon. However, a couple things to realize is that this is still significant. And there's a few kind of notions that this challenges. One is the fact that weaker countries would not challenge stronger countries, even in the Cold War, nuclear weapons, etc. Britain with a clear advantage here. They still decided. Argentina still decided to invade, which obviously was kind of an interesting predicament, much weaker power, but nonetheless, kind of showing that some of the weaker countries not intimidated by some of the stronger ones. Another reality, another notion we want to show is that both these countries looked to have war as a domestic distraction, especially Argentina. Well, this is a case in which we can see that using war as a domestic distraction is oftentimes a very poor decision. Finally, another thing that we want to kind of bring up here is the fact that both of the sides miscalculated each other. And again, because of this miscalculation, we turned into something that could have been maybe resolved in another way into actually a war. And luckily, not too many people killed, but at the same time, a lot of people killed for basically what it seems like very, very, very little. All right, let's take a look at Argentina. Well, obviously, if we're talking about Argentina, we have to remember they are pretty easily defeated here. And again, you're talking about a military, you're talking about a navy that was really looking for legitimacy. They were looking to show the power of their military, and this was anything but. Instead, they really were shown to be far inferior to the British and all else. Well, there is kind of a good thing that's brought out for many in Argentina, which is the fact that Galtieri and his army military regime will end almost directly after the Falklands War. People will grow weary. They are going to decide that this is not the person that they want to be in charge. Again, he has lost all legitimacy altogether, and so the authority of the army will be no longer. There's other factors obviously at play. It's not just this war, but because Galtieri will be out, this is going to help lead towards democracy starting to happen in Argentina, and so that's very positive and something we really want to be looking at and exploring here. So that's definitely a positive kind of component. Part of that includes that Galtieri and others in his military regime are going to be put on trial for their part in the Argentine Dirty War and other stuff like that. So, again, we can see here that there's definitely some accountability happening. And so, again, even though this war is certainly bad for Argentina, it's one of the things that's going to lead in the long run to Argentina becoming much more democratic. Even though obviously relations between Argentina and Britain will be somewhat tense, especially considering that Argentina tried to take a British colony, diplomatic relations will be restored within the next, 10 years between Britain and Argentina to kind of say, hey, look, we're still fine. We're not going to let these group of islands not make us be close. However, that being said, that doesn't mean necessarily everything's okay. And the reality is there will still continue to be issues between the two sides in the future of the Falklands, as well as British influence and all the rest of those type of things. Again, we need to realize that although not many die in the Falklands War, many of our soldiers are coming back from war with issues. Many committing suicide, who had witnesses the horrors of war and things like that. And again, this is 1982. This is before we're really diagnosing some of the traumas that people experience from the wartime. So a lot of this stuff is going undiagnosed, and as it is, not really going around to solving these kind of issues. So again, a problem and something that really needed to get resolved. All right, let's get Britain and let's see what happens to them. Well, obviously for Britain, this is a big moment because they are able to win. And although they do beat Argentina, which was a power that they should have beaten, the reality is it's still a victory, so it should not be discredited. Britain has minimal casualties, around 200 deaths, so again, relatively small. And again, if you think about it, that has to do with the fact that a lot of their force is, on air and sea, and then at the end they come in on the land. So the reality is it's a little bit different than the Argentinian experience. Now, one of the biggest results for Britain is going to be the political impact for Margaret Thatcher. And again, as we said before the war starts, she really hadn't lived up to her expectations of being the Iron Lady. Well, after the war, she is definitely the Iron Lady, and she has stood up to an act of aggression, and she's told another country, hey, look, you just can't come in here, even if it's something as insignificant as the Falklands, you just can't do this. And so that's a very significant moment. Those problems that she had before with authority over the Conservative Party in Parliament, she's going to solidify. Her leadership will be very strong. The Conservative Party in Britain will be very strong. And so, again, big successes happening there. This victory also leads to some British nationalism. Again, it's been a while since British nationalism has been high. Again, going back to this is the 1980s, World War II. Although they win, it's not really a big win. It's or anything like that. And so again, this leads to some feelings of patriotism, some feelings of pride. Hey, look, this British military. Yeah, we've gotten smaller. We've focused more on domestic affairs, but we're still here to compete. We're still here to win, etc. What we also see is at the same time, the British economy starts to recover. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to do with the Falklands War, but at the same time, it's also adding legitimacy to Margaret Thatcher and her rule. It's also adding legitimacy to the Conservative parties. And again, it's giving more and more legitimacy and credibility to people of Britain as they feel happy for what they're doing and what's going on. Again, similar to Argentina, though, we can't discredit the fact that many soldiers are coming back with PTSD and other service-related illnesses and disabilities. And so, again, most of these are undiagnosed. And so, again, that's a true tragedy of this war. Another thing is that after this happens, the British realize they need to establish a more formal British military presence in the Falklands. It's not going to be huge, but at the same time, they are going to add a significant number of military to kind of make sure the Falklands is protected. And so Argentina knows they just can't come in and just invade and expect no response. And so there is a British military presence there. Finally, we'll finish up with some final results and some other things that we want to kind of look at here and talk about. First off, again, this is in the middle of the Cold War. This is the 1980s. And so for the Soviet Union, they had largely kind of threw Britain out as being not very strong militarily. Hey, don't worry about them, etc. Well, after this war, They realized that British military power is much stronger than they expected. Again, if you think about it, definitely a reason for British success has to do with the Sea Harriers. It has to do with their good strategy. It has to do with their good planning, etc. And so the Soviet Union realizes, hey, one of the United States' strongest allies is relatively military strong. So, in order to respond to that, what we're going to see is that the natural response of the Soviet Union will be to strengthen their own allies and strengthen the Warsaw Pact. And so they'll add some more funding there. They'll try to, increase their military spending over there to make sure they are protected through their allies. For the U.S., kind of interesting. This is 1982, so this is less than 10 years after the end of Vietnam. And since the end of Vietnam, the U.S. had really been slow on intervening really anywhere. And so after this, they're kind of starting to realize, hey, you know what? We can still militarily intervene when necessary, and it's going to be okay. It's not going to be the end of the earth. Again, after Vietnam, there was a lot of views inside the United States, hey, we can't intervene anywhere. It's going to be so bad, etc. But after this, kind of realize, hey, look, yeah, let's do case by case. Let's see, there's a good possibility that we could involve ourselves and it's going to be okay. In the Falklands itself, we'll also see some population increase. Again, most of this has to do with the fact that there are more military people in the Falklands. So again, the population will increase. We also see the diversification of the economy. If you remember when we started, the economy was basically based on sheep farming. Well, we do see a large increase in tourism because of the Falklands War memorials and things. We also see some British negotiations and deals where fishing industries will increase as well. So again, the economy of the Falklands will become a little bit stronger, a little more diversified, not so much more, sheep farming and all the rest of those things. However, it's really important that we realize that there is still a dispute over this area. Again, even though it is still a British overseas colony where the Falklands are largely in control of what they do internally and the British are in control of foreign affairs and protection and all the rest, the reality is there is still a lot of dispute over the area and what exactly to do. And again, British-Argentine relations still are a little bit tense because of that. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Falklands War. We'll see you next time when we talk about the next case study of the Limited Wars, the first Gulf War. Have a great one. Talk to you soon.